little bit of a rundown. What is the Fuller Youth Institute? What do you do there? How long has it been going? Why does it exist? So just give us a good once over.
Yeah, great. I've been at the Fuller Youth Institute, or FYI, for a little over 15 years now, and which is about as long as we've been going. So since near the beginning. Work closely with Kara Powell, our executive director. We have an incredible team, and our whole vision is equipping leaders and parents to help young people, and in particular teenagers. And we kind of stand in that intersection between the research world and practice, what it looks like on the ground. And a lot of us are also youth leaders and parents. I'm both. I serve in my church in youth ministry, and also am a parent of a preteen, 2 teenagers, one of them heading to college this fall. So, yeah.
And that's where we've had a lot of our interaction. Obviously, when I worked in the church, I got to be a part of some really great cohorts that took place at Fuller, and it's kind of how we struck up our friendship. So I think this conversation we're going to have today is going to be so good for parents, because we're talking about anxiety, something that I believe every student deals with in some way, shape, or form. And I think, especially lately, we've been hearing so much about stress and anxiety in young people these days. Why is that? What's research telling us? What are you guys learning and uncovering about anxiety in young people?
Yeah, Justin, I really go a day without hearing something about teenage anxiety, depression, suicide. It feels like it's everywhere. And it felt like it was everywhere before pandemic. And then, now that we're kind of in the midst of this moment, it feels even more heightened. And I think there's a handful of things. A lot of folks point to technology, social media. These kids are growing up tethered to their smartphones, and they're figuring out who they are in the midst of a digital world, and everything that they do and say, it's broadcast to the world. And that creates all kinds of intensity and can contribute to anxiety. We think that's part of the picture. We don't think that's the whole culprit. And, as parents, it's really easy for us to look outside ourselves to blame. But and psychologists would say, some of today's anxiety among young people is also about parenting and how parenting styles have changed. We put a lot of pressure on our kids to perform. We put a lot of pressure on our kids. In part because we're also broadcasting their lives to the world on social media.
Yeah.
And, also this sort of parenting trend of we want to keep our kids happy at all costs. And so we jump in to save them, or we make it hard for them to deal with just sort of the normal annoyances of daily life. And we try to make things easier for them. And then one more layer is just, we live in a busy and high pressure society, and there's not a lot of margin in most teenagers' lives for them to have the downtime they need, the rest they need.
Yeah.
In some ways, the pandemic has kind of cracked that open for us to see, wow, so many of us were just pounding our schedule. And this new space in our lives gives us a chance to ask some good questions, I think, about that, and wonder, wow, when things get back to normal, whatever normal looks like, do we want to keep doing all these things? Do we want to go back to 5 nights a week of, soccer practice and private lessons? I don't know,
Yeah.
and I think those are really good questions for us to be asking now.
The school has been better at being proactive, talking about young people and stress and anxiety. And I think there's a space for the church to talk about this. Obviously, I believe that as a church person who's worked in the church for over a decade, I want to look uniquely at the parent side. How do we as parents continue to have the right conversations, open the right safe platform of dialogue with our kid about what they might be going through? Because sometimes our kid wants to meet the expectation we're putting out there, or they want to follow, they don't want to let us down, they want to follow through, whatever, and they will suffer in silence. Maybe they'll tell their close friends, but they'll deal with it and suffer internally. And that's not every kid, but it's a lot of kids right now. how do parents create that safe place for a student to say, you know what, actually, mom and dad, I'm actually not okay. Like things aren't going all right now. How can we help parents do that better?
Yeah. Yeah. So a big part of it is just not being afraid to make anxiety, depression, these kind of mental health broadly part of our conversations, part of our regular life. It's interesting when our kids are old enough to have an ID card or a driver's license in California, suicide prevention hotline is on the back of those cards. California mandated that high school identification cards bear that hotline. Had a friend who was taking her daughter on high school tours, and the student who was giving the tour said, "Oh, well, this is where you go when you're having a panic attack." There's a way that the conversation has been more normalized among younger generations, and sometimes as parents, maybe we need to acknowledge we're not as comfortable having those conversations. My 17-year-old just said the other night at our dinner table, I think that my generation, we're not afraid to say, I'm seeing a therapist. And I think it's harder for adults. And I think she's right. So some of it is, how can we kind of crack that open and make mental health part of our regular conversations, part of the discipleship conversation? What's interesting is, we may not even be aware of how much we unintentionally stigmatize talking about anxiety by not talking about it. Our kids often know friends who are hurting, even if they're not hurting themselves. And, they may have a friend who's asking them for help or who's told them not to tell or something like that. And the more we can open that up, the better. I was talking with my daughter who's a freshman not that long ago, who, there was somebody who was kind of reaching out to her through Instagram and was telling her that she was struggling. And then she started telling her things like, I'm suicidal, and, I think I'm going to hurt myself. And I was so glad my daughter was able to say to me, hey, this is happening and I don't know what to do. I'm not sure what I should do next, but I don't think I can help her. And I was like, I think you're right. I think, you don't have to be the one to bear that burden on your shoulders. And so we talked about passing on the suicide helpline to her, encouraging her to talk to her parents, encouraging her to seek help from an adult, to reach out to someone other than another teenager. In the teenage years, young people want to lean on their peers and their friends for help. And that's really important. Developmentally, that's really important. And their friends can't hold their heavy burdens, and sometimes we need to help our kids see that sometimes they need more help, sometimes they need more insight, sometimes they need professional care. And a teenager shouldn't be the one making that decision on behalf of another teenager.
What I
so
love
some
that
of
you're
it's,
saying,
go ahead.
the thing that I love that you're saying is that it's developmentally appropriate for them to connect with their peers and to talk about, heavy stuff that's happening in their life. That's normal. The thing that we need to do is teaching our kids that when things come up that it's just too big for you, that I'm a safe person to come to. You can come, you're not going to be in trouble. I'm not going to be angry that you went to your friend first, or that you guys are talking about this kind of stuff, that you can come to me. There's no judgment and I'm here to help you.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes parents won't bring these topics up because we're afraid we might say something that they're not thinking about, or we might make something worse, right?
We'll plant the idea in their head and then they'll start thinking like, I say elephants and all you can think about are elephants.
Right, right.
How accurate is that? Because I've actually heard that before. Like we don't want to have the sex conversation because, we don't want to talk about, blowjobs, because then they're going to be like thinking about blowjobs all the time. But
right.
I don't think that's how it works, but you're the expert. You tell us, is that accurate? If we talk to our kid about anxiety and depression, are they going to, magically now become super anxious and depressed all the time?
Yeah. So we asked some psychologists about this because, we're not that kind of expert. So we asked the real experts, right?
Yeah.
And what we hear from mental health professionals is, kids are already surrounded by these things. Kids are surrounded by these topics and ideas, and it's not like they've never heard of a kid cutting themselves or, you know, thinking about hurting themselves, killing themselves, in the same way that it's not like they've never thought about or heard about other kids talking about sex or sexual acts.
Yeah.
So what we want them to know is that it's okay to talk about it at home. And in many cases, young people are actually relieved to talk about it. Now, I got to say, and this from personal experience too, there are things we have thought we've talked about with our kids that they've said, oh, no, you haven't really talked about that. Or why don't you talk about this more? And so I think we need to almost, you know, move ourselves past that sense of, oh, they know what we think about this, or, oh, they know they can come to me. We need to over communicate. We need to oversay it.
Is that because parents, like in your opinion, is that because parents had a cryptic conversation that they thought the kid kind of got the point, or that they've just been living life around their kid enough that the kids kind of picked up, you know, this is where we stand on things like this? Like, what do you,
absolutely,
inside the mind of the parent, what's the reason for feeling that way?
Yeah. No, just what you said, you know, yeah, of course we've talked about this. Or of course we had that one conversation where we said, you can always come to me if you are struggling with something, right? And
that
the
means
teenage brain, yeah, and a lot's going on in the teenage brain. So some of this is that there's constantly, you know, unwiring and rewiring. So neurologically, there's so much change that's happening that, I mean, quite literally a conversation you had 2 months ago with your developing adolescent, they might have completely forgotten that conversation. They might have, I mean, their brain might have just wired around it in a way that, you know, we need to say it again. We need to say it again. And in terms of the being really clear, you know, therapists would say, don't hesitate to say really clearly, some people have thoughts about dying or about killing themselves when they feel totally overwhelmed. Do you ever have those kinds of thoughts? Being 100% clear instead of using euphemisms or saying something vague, like you can always talk to me. Therapists would say the risks of asking are far lower than the risks of not asking. Yeah. That's counterintuitive to me as a parent, but that the risks of not asking are greater than the risks.
You know, I told one of my parents that I was talking with you today about anxiety, and they texted me this question, a very simple question. My kid has anxiety. Is there anything that I can do that would make that anxiety worse? I think that's a question that a lot of parents are wondering, because they maybe know something is going on with their kid and they don't want to make it worse. What are the things that parents could actually do to make it worse? Or is that a bad question? You know, not a bad question, but is that a bad a premise to begin with?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we not talking about it at all actually can make it worse, right? Mm-hmm. And in the same way that kind of trying to jump in and fix it can make it worse. And so I think what we can do is really check in to see what's your anxiety like right now. So, you know, in particular, if your kid is bringing it up, because sometimes teenagers will, you know, and I have one who will, thankfully, who will talk to us when anxiety is feeling overwhelming. And, you know, that's actually like a best case scenario. But I think for parents, the worst thing we can do in that case is get really anxious ourselves or, you know, try to well, let's fix this, or to downplay it. Well, that's not really true. So instead, what we can do is kind of check in, you know, what's this like right now? If you could rate this on a scale of 1 to 10, with, you know, 10 being the worst, right? If it's like a 1 to 3, it's no big deal. If it's a 4 to 5, they can probably handle it on their own. If it's like a 6 or above, they might need some help and maybe a trained professional, you know. And if that kid is already seeing a therapist, you know, if it's like a 9 or 10, that might mean like an extra check-in, you know, or let's reach out for help. It might mean asking that question if we haven't asked before, you know, hey, do you think talking with someone would be helpful? Do you think meeting with a therapist might be helpful? And just to normalize that, everybody needs extra help sometimes. Sometimes we all need someone who can help give us strategies. That's also one way we talk about it is, I wonder if there are some strategies, some things that you could do when you're feeling this way that can just kind of help bring it down. Another thing that we can do is to help our kids stop and breathe deeply. We've heard that advice before, well, just stop or take a breath, but we don't always understand why. So when we start to panic, our hearts beat faster. This is just a natural automatic response, right? And this is a way that our heart is trying to get oxygen to the rest of our body when we sense that we're under threat, when it's some kind of emergency. And so what breathing slowly does is it actually helps to tell our heart we're not in emergency status, there's not a threat. It can get more oxygen. It doesn't have to work as hard. And as our heart rate decreases, then our brain gets the message, okay, we're not so out of control right now. And, as maybe simple or simplistic as it sounds, I mean, breathing, getting enough air can be the difference between a kid who's totally out of control and overwhelmed and a kid who can begin to access those parts of their brain that are a little more rational. And that can then help them even process. They can't even talk through what's going on when their heart is racing and their body is in this like panic mode.
For a parent that their kid is struggling with this, should they bring other people into that circle of kind of knowing what's going on, the kid's youth pastor or the coach or someone at the school? Maybe the kid hasn't said anything at school yet, they've only talked about it at home. Should the parent bring some people into the loop so that everyone's kind of aware, like, hey, something's going on here with my kid? Or is that a huge break in trust and confidence? How does a parent navigate doing what's best for their kid while also, maybe that kid doesn't want everyone knowing that they're dealing with this?
Yeah. Well, yes, a kid needs a team around them. Yes, a kid needs a broader circle of support. And I think, especially with our teenagers, we need to navigate that with them. And so I would start that conversation with, hey, everybody needs a circle of support around them. And, I think that it would really help you to have some other adults in your life who know about what's going on and who can just be aware and attuned to that. And to make that suggestion, and to suggest, hey, what about this coach or this teacher or this youth leader, this church leader, and it might mean that they want to start just by telling one person, that might take a while. Or it might be too that we want to clue in the people who are with them in those particular anxiety producing moments. If this is about anxiety and it's about anxiety around a math test, for example, that causes them panic attacks, then to say, could we talk with your math teacher about that? That would be like a really specific one. Broadly, for a teenager to know, hey, this mentor or this leader in my life also knows what is going on. It helps to disarm the power of that thing as a secret. Because when it's a secret, it has more power over us as something that might feel shameful or might feel like I don't have my act together because I need help. It goes back to like some of those stigmas that we carry, even really unintentionally. So silence can be another stigma. At the same time, I think we need to walk with our kids through that because, they may not want to know. They may not want their sister to know that they're seeing a therapist. That's there's a certain level of comfort that we need to pace with a teenager alongside there too.
For the kid who says off the bat, I don't want that, mom, dad, I do not want to let everyone in on this. I don't want to let anyone know, like, at all. It doesn't mean the conversation's dead in the water. It means, this is what I think it means. Please correct me. I think it means that that's something you let sit for the moment, and it's something to re-engage a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I don't know what time frame you'd put to it, but just because they say it at the first reaction, I don't want anyone to know, don't tell anyone, doesn't mean that that's how they're going to feel, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks from then. How, after hearing an initial no, because I think a lot of students might react with, no, I don't want anyone to know. I've told you, mom, I've told you, dad, I don't want anyone else to know. Role play with me. How would you re-engage that? What's the right way for a parent to re-engage that after hearing the initial no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would, I mean, initially, I would try to keep the door open and say something like, well, maybe we could talk about this again, in a few days or in a week or so. That's one way I would leave that open. And I would think about an example from our own life of how having support has helped us.
Oh, I love
about, having someone else in our life has made a difference for us. Maybe it was about, anxiety or a mental health issue, or maybe it was about something else, but most of us can access those stories. I would, the power of other people in our lives. This is something where, Justin, we kind of have to be countercultural here.
Mm-hmm.
Because our kids are growing up in this society that we, most of us grew up in, if we grew up in the US context, of hyper-individualism, of, you control your destiny, you are the person who's in charge of your life. This is all about your happiness and being your best self. I mean, these are the messages that surround young people as they're growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, it takes some counteracting that to say, actually, we need people. We need other people in our lives. And being vulnerable with other people is one way that that's how we get towards being whole. That's how we get towards healing. That's how we get towards being actually who we were created to be, is when other people are in our lives. And it's not weakness to let other people in on what's going on with us. It's strength. It's tapping into strength because we need others. So there's something, there's the surface level, and then there's sort of the deeper level of that I think takes more than one conversation for sure.
I love that. I love that. As we're wrapping up here, if you were a parent of a kid right now, which you are, and you're facing what is going on with schools. I mean, schools have been shut down for a while. Everyone is there. There's no clarity on what's happening, with the start of next school year. If you're a parent of a kid who definitely has some anxiety in their life, is there anything uniquely that they can do to be helping them through this process of confusion? Because obviously this is a very confusing time for everybody. How would you give some advice or coaching direction for that parent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's all of us right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is disruptive. And one thing that I've found that's helpful is just to keep naming, hey, nothing's normal right now. And every day is going to feel a little different. And that's okay. So I think normalizing the disruption, normalizing that we all feel a little off and that some days are going to be worse than others. And then to be watching out for what's more off than normal. So I find this personally really tricky right now because I kind of had a sense for my teenagers' normal rhythms and for what was a bad day and what was worse than a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
In this extended pandemic, quarantine, uncertainty, it's harder to know. And so the general signs that experts tell us to look out for is, what seems more intense or pronounced than usual for this teenager? And I think we got to be reading that more closely than ever. And when we're not sure, ask, hey, are things feeling pretty overwhelming for you? Or how, again, that scale of 1 to 10,
Yeah.
especially if they're showing signs that they're having trouble managing, trouble dealing with everyday life, or where it seems like their daily life rhythm is just, completely out of whack or unmanageable for them. And this one's maybe obvious, but when they start to use really unhealthy strategies to cope, self-harm, substances, anything that feels like a destructive strategy, that for sure is when we need to step in. But in general, trust your gut. If you feel like something is up, ask about it. If a lot of teenagers are moving towards, they're becoming more nocturnal, they're staying up later, they're sleeping in, even more than usual summer. And I think if we're starting to get a little worried about that, and feel like maybe it's beyond normal, to check in about it. It might just be they're needing a little bit of space because they're cramped with their family all the time, and staying up late is a way to get a little bit of space. But it might be something more. So just not to be afraid to ask. And then to not be afraid to seek help and to try to normalize that. Hey, when we're feeling sick physically, we go to a doctor. And when things are a little off more than usual emotionally, when we're having trouble regulating our emotions, when we're having trouble dealing with anxiety, we might need extra help.
Yeah.
Do you think it'd be helpful to talk to somebody now? And again, I think that can be a repeat ask. And quite honestly too, it's pressing through. And sometimes I think it's telling our kids, hey, I think you need something more right now. We would really like you to do this. We're going to do this with you. We're going to do it together, but we feel like you need some extra help. And being, sometimes being that parent who says something that's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Because I love it, but I think parents are going to love this. Faith in an Anxious World. That's the research, the curriculum. We're going to put links to it in the notes so people can go and download this, check this out. But give a quick plug for it. How do you see a parent being able to use this? Are there any stories of parents that really stick out to you that have used it and seen some really great outcomes from it? Just give a solid plug for Faith in an Anxious World.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so we created a ministry curriculum. There are some videos that are part of that series that I think any family could use. I think you could absolutely recommend it to your youth ministry if you're a parent, and think that your high school ministry in particular could pick it up and use it. There are family components, so we created some discussion guides, and those have sparked some great conversations. And then this is, any parent beyond, getting the curriculum. We created a short podcast series where Kara and I interview psych experts on different aspects of the topics that we cover in the curriculum. And so we talk about, anxiety, depression, suicide. We talk about mindfulness. We talk about practices, just really, really practical stuff that can help. So I would really recommend that podcast series too. It's the Faith in an Anxious World Parent Podcast. And then beyond our own resources, I also just want to make sure parents hear the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's a really, really important resource. Put that number in your phone. You can look it up at any time, but I recommend that parents put it in their phones and give it to their kids. It's suicidepreventionlifeline.org is where you can check out all the different kind of ways that young people can reach out. There's also the Steve Fund crisis text line for young people of color in particular. And, they really work to connect young people of color with therapists and helpers who can understand their unique realities. So I want to make sure to mention that before we wrap up.
I love that. So good. The links will be in the notes of the show. Brad, thank you so much for making time, for being available for this. I know parents are going to love it. R12, thank you for tuning in, and have a really great day. We love you. We're praying for you. We'll see you later.